Diana Ross was 25 years old, and at the peak of her power as the lead singer of the Supremes, when she first encountered a 9-year-old boy from Gary, Indiana, who sang like someone twice his age and moved like someone who had been performing for decades. The year was 1967. Motown was the center of the American music universe, and Berry Gordy was its architect, and Diana Ross was the crown jewel of everything Gordy had built. The face, the voice, the embodiment of the dream that a black woman from the projects of Detroit could become the most celebrated entertainer in the country if the talent was real and the infrastructure around it was right. Michael Jackson was 9 years old and performing with his brothers as the Jackson 5, and the connection that formed between these two people in that period, a connection that would last for the rest of Michael's life, that would shape him in ways no other relationship did, that would be misunderstood and mythologized and reduced to tabloid speculation for decades, is one of the most consequential and most genuinely moving relationships in the history of American popular music. The real story of Michael Jackson and Diana Ross is not the story that the gossip columns told. It is not a romance, not a scandal, not the projection of two celebrity names onto each other for the purpose of generating headlines. It is something rarer and more complicated and ultimately more heartbreaking than any of those simplified narratives. It is the story of a child who did not have a childhood finding in a woman who was not his mother, the closest thing to maternal love and unconditional acceptance that he would experience for much of his life. And it is the story of what happens to that bond over decades of fame and pressure and the specific cruelties that the entertainment industry inflicts on the people it most needs and most exploits. Berry Gordy has stated in interviews and in his autobiography that it was Diana Ross who first brought the Jackson 5 to his serious attention. The commonly circulated story that Diana Ross discovered the Jackson 5 and presented them to Motown is more complicated in its historical specifics. Bobby Taylor, a Motown artist who had seen the Jackson 5 perform in Chicago, was the first person to bring them to Gordy's formal attention. But Diana Ross's endorsement, her enthusiasm for the group, and specifically for the extraordinary child at its center, carried weight at Motown that few other endorsements could match. When Diana Ross believed in something or someone, Berry Gordy listened. And Diana Ross believed in Michael Jackson with an immediacy and an intensity that went beyond professional recognition of talent. She saw something in him that resonated at a personal level, a quality of sensitivity, of emotional depth, of a child who was somehow already carrying more than a child should carry. That spoke to something in her own experience of what it meant to grow up inside the machinery of fame. The early years of Michael's time at Motown were years in which Diana Ross was a constant and deliberate presence in his life. She hosted the press conference in August 1969 that introduced the Jackson 5 to the media, standing beside them, endorsing them with her name and her celebrity at a moment when her name and celebrity were at their maximum commercial value. She spent time with Michael specifically, not just with the group, not just with the Jackson brothers as a collective, but with Michael as an individual in ways that the other brothers noticed and remembered. She took him to events. She introduced him to people. She showed him how to navigate the specific environment of Motown and the broader entertainment industry, the etiquette, the relationships, the unspoken rules of an industry that had specific expectations of the people who operated within it. What Michael absorbed from Diana Ross in those years was not primarily musical. He was already a musician of extraordinary natural ability before he ever met her. What he absorbed was something about how to be a star, how to carry the weight of public attention, how to present yourself, how to manage the gap between the person you are in private and the persona that the public requires. Diana Ross had spent a decade navigating that gap by the time Michael encountered her. She had learned, with considerable pain and at considerable personal cost, what it meant to be the face of something larger than yourself, to have your image managed and your public persona shaped by institutional forces that had interests distinct from your own. She passed some of that knowledge to Michael in the informal, unstructured way that mentorship operates when it is genuine, not through formal instruction, but through observation, through example, through the thousands of small moments of showing rather than telling. Michael, for his part, attached to Diana Ross with an intensity that the people around him found striking even at the time. He talked about her constantly. He studied her performances. He borrowed elements of her presentation, the physical elegance, the commitment to spectacle as an essential component of entertainment rather than an addition to it, the understanding that an audience comes not just to hear music, but to experience something that exceeds what music alone can provide. When journalists in later years asked Michael who had influenced him most as a performer, he consistently named James Brown, Fred Astaire, and Diana Ross. And the Diana Ross influence was different in kind from the others. Brown and Astaire were technical influences, masters of craft whose specific techniques he studied and absorbed and built upon. Diana Ross was something else. She was an emotional influence, a personal influence, the first person outside his family who made him feel that what he was, not just what he could do, but what he was, had extraordinary value. This distinction matters because of what Michael's relationship with his own family was like in those years. Joe Jackson, Michael's father, was a man whose approach to his children's talent was extractive rather than nurturing. A man who understood that his sons had commercial value and who organized the family. His life around maximizing that value in ways that the children paid for in ordinary childhood experiences they never had, in fear that was chronic and sometimes acute, in the specific damage that comes from having your worth defined entirely by your performance. Michael was afraid of his father. This is not a retrospective interpretation imposed on the past. It is something Michael said explicitly and repeatedly in interviews across decades, said with a directness and a lack of self-pity that made the accounts more rather than less credible. Joe Jackson hid his children. He humiliated them. He called Michael ugly, told him his nose was wrong, used the specific vulnerabilities of a sensitive child as tools of control and correction. The Michael Jackson who stood on stage and performed with radiant confidence was a child who went home to an environment where the confidence was systematically undermined by the person who should have protected it. Diana Ross did not replace Joe Jackson as a parental figure in any formal or institutional sense. She did something more subtle and in some ways more significant. She provided a counter experience, a different data point about what it felt like to be in the presence of an adult who saw you clearly and responded to what they saw with warmth rather than with control. When Diana Ross told Michael he was extraordinary, she was not managing him. She was not extracting value from him. She was responding to something genuine that she had observed in him, and Michael could feel the difference. The child who had been told his nose was wrong by his father was told by Diana Ross that he was beautiful. The child who had been defined by his commercial usefulness was seen by Diana Ross as a person whose inner life had intrinsic worth. The impact of this on a child who was simultaneously experiencing global celebrity and profound personal insecurity cannot be overstated. The emotional intimacy of the relationship between Diana Ross and Michael Jackson was not romantic in any conventional sense in those early years. He was a child and she was an adult woman, and the nature of what passed between them was the emotional intimacy of a mentorship that had acquired the warmth of family. But it was a relationship without a clean category, and the absence of a clean category made it vulnerable to the projections of people who observed it from the outside and needed to assign it a meaning that fit their existing frameworks. The tabloid speculation about the nature of their relationship began early and never entirely stopped. And Michael found this speculation bewildering and painful in the specific way that it is painful when something that is real and important and personal to you is misrepresented by people who have no access to what it actually is. As Michael's career developed through the 1970s and as Diana's own trajectory shifted, the departure from Motown, the move to RCA, the films including Lady Sings, The Blues, and Mahogany, the reinvention of her public persona as a solo artist of global stature, the nature of their relationship evolved in ways that reflected both of their changed circumstances. Michael was no longer a child. He was a young man of extraordinary talent in his own right, no longer the protege of Diana Ross, but an artist whose commercial and cultural impact was beginning to exceed hers in certain specific and significant ways. The dynamic between mentor and mentee always requires adjustment as the mentee develops, and this adjustment is one of the most delicate and often most painful transitions in any genuine mentoring relationship, because it requires the mentor to release a version of the relationship that has been emotionally sustaining, and it requires the mentee to establish an independent identity that does not depend on the mentor's validation. Michael never entirely completed this transition with Diana Ross, and the reasons why illuminate something important about the specific nature of what she had provided to him. The validation Diana gave him was not the validation of professional success. He had access to that from multiple sources, in quantities that exceeded anything she could have provided. It was the validation of personal worth, the reassurance that who he was beneath the performance was worthwhile and lovable, and that specific category of reassurance is one that people who have been deprived of it in childhood continue to seek across their lifetimes in ways that professional success does not satisfy. Michael could sell out stadiums on every continent and still need to hear that he was enough, and Diana Ross had been one of the first people to tell him he was, which gave her a permanent significance in his emotional landscape that was not diminished by his subsequent achievements. The public dimension of their relationship during Michael's peak years in the 1980s was complicated by the specific pressures of two major celebrity careers operating simultaneously in a media environment that had intensified considerably since the late 1960s. The Thriller era, the period between 1982 and 1985 when Michael Jackson became arguably the most famous person on the planet, this was a period of such extraordinary public pressure and such relentless media scrutiny that many of his personal relationships contracted or deformed under the weight of it. Diana Ross was not immune to the general pressure that Michael's fame placed on everyone around him, but she was better equipped than most to understand what he was experiencing because she had her own history with extreme celebrity and its specific deformations. There were tensions in those years that people close to both of them have acknowledged in various accounts. Diana Ross had her own career to manage, her own image to protect, her own complicated relationship with Motown's legacy and Berry Gordy and the industry forces that had shaped her. Michael's increasing eccentricity, the Neverland Ranch, the chimpanzee, the hyperbaric chamber, the changing physical appearance that became a subject of global commentary and speculation, put his relationships under a specific kind of strain. Diana understood, better than most, the impulse to create a private world that functioned as a refuge from public scrutiny. But she also had concerns. Concerns she expressed to him directly, in private, in the way that people who genuinely care about each other can express concerns that they would never express to the press. Michael did not always receive those concerns well. He was a man who had learned from the specific injuries of his childhood to experience expressions of concern as potential threats, as prefaces to criticism, as indications that even the people he trusted might find him lacking. The hardest part of the real story of Michael Jackson and Diana Ross is the part that neither of them ever spoke about publicly in comprehensive terms. The part about the ways in which Michael's specific psychological damage, inflicted across decades that began in childhood and never truly stopped, made genuine intimacy increasingly difficult for him to sustain even with the people he most needed it from. The public cruelty that Michael experienced, the relentless mockery of his appearance, the criminal accusations of 1993 and 2003 that, regardless of their ultimate legal resolution, inflicted a public humiliation whose scale and sustained duration was nearly unprecedented in the history of celebrity. Did not make him more open to the people who cared about him. It made him more defended, more isolated, more likely to retreat into the controlled environment of Neverland and the managed relationships of a man whose trust had been exploited so many times that extending it felt like a form of self-destruction. Diana Ross reached toward him in those years in the ways she could. She defended him publicly when his reputation was under attack. She maintained the connection through the specific kind of loyal presence that does not require constant contact to remain real. She was not present in the daily management of his life in the way that some people around him were. She was not one of the inner circle who had access to Neverland and to Michael's day-to-day existence. But she was not absent either. She held a place in his life that the people who cycled in and out of his inner circle did not hold. The place of someone who had known him before he became the icon, who had seen him as a child with a child's needs and a child's vulnerabilities, who carried in her knowledge of him a version of Michael Jackson that his fame had not yet distorted. When Michael died on June 25, 2009, Diana Ross's grief was public and unguarded in a way that her public persona did not typically permit. She posted a message asking what more she could have done, a question whose rawness spoke to something she had been carrying about their relationship. But about the distance that his last years had imposed between them, about the ways in which the crisis of his final period had created an isolation that the people who loved him were not able to fully penetrate. The question, what more could I have done, is not the question of an acquaintance or a professional colleague. It is the question of someone who loved someone and is reckoning with the specific grief of love that was present but not sufficient, of connection that survived but could not save. The heartbreak at the center of this story is not melodramatic. It does not fit the narrative structure of a tragedy in the classical sense. With clear villains and a single catastrophic error, it is the quieter and more devastating heartbreak of two people who genuinely mattered to each other, who gave each other real things across decades of shared history, and who nonetheless could not bridge the specific distances that Michael's damage and Diana's own limitations and the extraordinary pressures of their public lives imposed between them. Michael needed more than Diana could give, because what he needed was something that no single human relationship could have provided. The repair of injuries so deep and so early that they had shaped his fundamental experience of the world and of himself. And Diana, who understood this better than most, could not fix it and lived with the weight of that inability. Michael named Diana Ross in his will as a potential guardian for his children should something happen to their mother, a detail that received significant media coverage at the time of his death, and that speaks more clearly than almost any other single fact about the nature and the depth of what she meant to him. You name someone as a guardian for your children when you trust them with the most important thing you have. You name someone as a guardian when you believe they will provide your children with what they need at the most fundamental level. Michael Jackson, who had complex and sometimes fractured relationships with almost everyone in his life, who had been exploited and betrayed by people he trusted, and who carried the resulting damage in everything he did, named Diana Ross as someone he trusted with his children. That is not a casual designation. That is a testament. The story of their relationship across more than 4 decades of American cultural history reflects something true about the nature of the bonds that form between people who meet at the intersection of extraordinary talent and extraordinary need. Bonds that do not fit the categories that biographical narrative typically offers, that are neither romance nor simple friendship nor professional alliance, but something compounded of all of those things and irreducible to any of them. Diana Ross saw Michael Jackson when he was 9 years old and understood something about him that most people around him did not understand. He was not simply a remarkably talented child. He was a child who was already being consumed by the machinery of his own gift, already paying prices for his talent that no child should be asked to pay, already carrying a weight that would have been heavy for an adult. She responded to that understanding with a warmth and a loyalty that she maintained for the rest of his life. Michael Jackson carried Diana Ross in his heart from the age of 9 until his death at 50. He carried her as the first person outside his family who told him he was enough. He carried her as proof that the world outside the Jackson family home could contain people who saw him and responded with love rather than with demand. He carried her as the embodiment of a kind of grace and elegance and survival under pressure that he aspired to and never entirely achieved. And Diana Ross carried Michael, carried the version of him she had first known, the 9-year-old whose talent was already supernatural, but whose need was still visible, and carried the grief of watching that child become an icon and then become a casualty and being unable, despite everything, to prevent it. That is the real story, not the tabloid story, not the speculation about the precise nature of a bond that resisted categorization. The real story is this. A child who needed to be seen was seen by a woman who had the capacity to see him and who chose to. And that seeing mattered for the rest of his life in ways that nothing else entirely replicated. And when it ended with his death, it left behind a grief in her that the public question, what more could I have done, carries in its forewords more honestly and more completely than any biographical summary could. It is a story about love that does not fit a category. It is a story about what people give each other across the distances that fame and damage impose. It is a story about the specific loneliness of being Michael Jackson, of being the most watched person in the world and one of the most profoundly alone. And it is a story about Diana Ross, who was not his mother and not his lover and not simply his mentor, but who was something that his life required and that she provided as fully as anyone could have, which was not fully enough, which was nobody's fault, which is what makes it heartbreaking. The greatest entertainer of his generation died asking for more love than the world had ever given him, and the woman who had given him more of it than almost anyone else was left asking whether she could have given more. The answer to her question is probably no. The need was too large, and the damage was too deep, and the forces arrayed against him were too powerful. But the question itself, raw and public and unashamed in its grief, is the truest thing either of them ever communicated about what passed between them. What passed between them was real. It mattered. It lasted. And it was not enough, and that insufficiency is not a failure of love, but a testament to the scale of what Michael Jackson carried and the impossibility of carrying it. Diana Ross could not save him. She knew him. She loved him. She reached toward him across every distance his fame and his damage imposed, and when he was gone, she asked the question that genuine love always asks when it survives the person it was given to. What more could I have done? The answer is written in everything they were to each other across 40 years. It is a heartbreaking answer. It is an honest one.